Hello, here we are in the brilliant Nordic summer lighting. Uh, Quick point about that, there's some reflection from the window in front of me on my specs, and I can't unsee it, right? I mean, I'm kind of like this creature, who's like trying to, get rid of that. Or when it's on the screen, I'll get it off. No, it's okay. I'll try to live with it. You have to try to live with it too. And if you can't, then we can suffer together. Lots of questions because there were not enough questions in April. And so the accumulated questions in May, after I cranked about it, is a lot. Let's jump in with Helma's inquiry because it's not, I chose to regard this as a contribution, although it may have been just a casual comment on her part. I had mentioned in the Patreon about, in fact, I presented a fair amount and done a little activity with my game Shine a Light, which is one of 4, as I called them, little games about religion. And they are available for free. Go through if you want them. Just go into where you get my games and click on this thing. I just call it. I called it Nomen Nudum, which you can look up for what that means. And there's 4 of them. Okay, so Helma says, I find myself wondering what the other 3 little games about religion look like and what the motivation is to write little games about religion. The first part's easy. I had always made them available, but they weren't very obvious, so I put them in a little pack, stuck them in the payhip, and now, if you're wondering what the other 3 are like or what all 4 are like, now you just go click. That's easy. What the motivation is to write little games about religion. Really don't want to go into like an hour and a half on this one thing, and you don't want me to either, I'm pretty sure. I will do a swift bullet point. 1, evolutionary biologist. Did a lot of my academic career in northern Florida, and significantly 1 year of my first professor job at Valdosta State University in southern Georgia. And before you think, oh no, it was terrible, he was surrounded by Christians, with Z, I guess. No, it's actually kind of important to recognize that I found, once past their fear that I was, coming after them with a moral bomb to, throw on them to blow up all their morality. Once that particular threat that they had heard from others was dissipated, then they were really, really, really interested. The actual intellectual drive at Valdosta State University was superior to a great deal of well-known, well-regarded, well-respected university experiences that I've encountered. So anyway, however, learning to understand how others are looking at their own religions was a big part of learning how to teach evolutionary biology. So think of that as an ongoing thing that went on for many, many, many years in my life. Despite a personal disinclination, if all is said and done and that particular job weren't involved, a disinclination in regard to, how you personally look at religion. I'm kind of like, at least at the time, I was like, why on earth would I care? Since then, I have learned that it is of human interest to care, that to understand how you relate to that term is, or what you do relative to that term, often without knowing how you relate to it, is a big deal. So, okay, so right there you have this ongoing bedrock of experience with that issue. There's also maybe, who knows, I even mock myself in one of the little manuscripts. Is it like a thing that a guy, in his 40s, suddenly just becomes interested in God and stuff? Is that like a, some guys run off and buy Porsches, some people, throw away all their money on some mistress, some, want to talk about God and, write novels about it or something. I don't know. But in my case, it was largely a matter of having found a very effective way of communicating with others about this and learning a lot from it. I, of course, was working on Shahida up through the point where I started writing these things in 2010. And that, of course, gave me or resulted in the kind of historical perspective that to me matters most. I already had, I think, a surprisingly decent historical understanding, but not as good as it got. So upon gaining that understanding, I was very pleased with my ability. Well, no, that sounds awful. I was much better able to share, right? To see, remember, role playing for me is a medium of expression. I'm going to be expressing things that I'm encountering, that I'm feeling, that I'm relating to people about, that I'm doing. And so in working on Shahida, this was something extremely important. And so those interrelationships with others become part of what I find myself expressing through role playing. And Shahida, of course, is extremely historical and political, and and it does not concern itself with the personal experience. And so I think that's where these little games popped out, is I encountered a great deal of people's personal experience. And so learning how to connect with that, learning how to relate it to how I see things or do things, becomes involved as a means of expression. I never wanted to turn these into commercial products. Sometimes I muse about it, but really, seriously, they're fucking weird. And I just also went cuckoo on the designs. So let's see. Estimated Profit in 2010, the first version, Shine a Light, and Cathedral being in January of 2011. Then a few years go by, and I added a fourth, Demon Lover. They're all small. They're all definitely out of the ordinary for the procedures and the presumed experience. Fortunately, through the years, I've had the chance to play all of them, although not enough, but enough so that when I hit the manuscripts again, and kind of gave up the originalism of the original inspiration, and really got to work on them. Now I think they're playable. I don't know about done. They're all quite playable, transferable at this point. So that's pretty much the motivation. There's a couple of other details. Of course, I was got to work on what would eventually become my book, The Edge of Evolution, which draws upon both historical and experiential aspects of religion in certain parts of it as relevant. So therefore, it was on my mind. It had turned into new understandings and new means of connecting with other people. And once that stuff is going on in my life, then you will find things coming out in my role-playing designs. So for those of you who are put off by this entirely, well, I don't care. But first, you should understand that the one variable that's missing from all of them is belief. I'm not very interested in belief. I'm interested in lots of other things. Each of them is about a fairly distinctive thing that I'm very interested in about these things. And it's pretty explicit in each one. If you're interested, go to PayHip. It's called Nomen Nudum, right? And it's just 4 small PDFs for free. Okay, so I hope that helps or is interesting to anybody. Now, what's next? Much more of a role-playing-y thing. Oh, okay, so what's next is actually also a bit historical. It concerns the relationship of these two products, one being Trollbabe, specifically the 2008-2009 finalized version, and the Italian translation dating from the same time. without getting into the details of the question, it's from Claudio. Let's say that what's really being asked here is that the sequence of events and the role of the dialogue for the translation relative to the changes in the design of the game. Okay, so the sequence goes like this. I actually had to write it out. First of all, I rewrote Troll Babe in 2007, 2008. And I did that by myself and in English. And so I sat down, went to a coffee shop every day, and, just started writing it from scratch because I had decided a lot between 2003 and 2008. There was a lot of big transitions for me in terms of role-playing and writing. And I said, Troll Babe deserves, this. So that's what I did. And then this is about exactly the same time that Narrativa and I arrived at an agreement for licensing my games for translation, and they wanted Troll Babe first, which I thought was a good idea. And so therefore I passed along what was effectively, a finished manuscript. But then we went into the translation process. The translator had lots and lots of questions. Now, they varied all over the place, as with all translations. First, there are things that the translator is bringing as their own issues, and you simply have to answer because you need those issues to be cleared up. You can't always, you can't always resolve all these issues, but you can say, okay, well, this is how you're looking at it, and this is how the game really is, and so we have to talk through this. The second is issues of phrasing, obviously. Translation. I mean, I'm a very idiomatic writer. Anybody who's done translations on my stuff finds themselves, wondering, should I just take this section, which is slangy, and turn it into slang in, my language, my native language, or do I, try to arrive at the purpose of the slanginess and then kind of basically rewrite it, whether it's slangy or not, toward that purpose? All sorts of perfectly legitimate questions. We all know that just a dictionary-based translation is terrible. You have to have these interpretive things. So you're going to have tons of dialogue about this. And in many cases, the translator actually has to make the final call because that's their job. So then there's also issues of game clarity and particularly details of how something is done. Now, here the questions tends to be vastly overpurposed. If I go by all the different translators that I've worked with and all these different games, I would have to say that comes down to about 15% quality time of all those kinds of questions. The rest are, well, again, they may be coming from that translator's own personal struggles, or they may be coming from a number of assumptions, but there's a lot of dialogue about that. But again, there's really no way for the primary author to say, and that's the way you need to say it, because it's going to be in this other language, and how it's said really is the translator's job. So, that was a long sentence, so I needed the coffee. Basically, no game design was done during that translation process. There was all this enormous dialogue. And since I was putting together the English publication at the same time, it cannot help, but some of that dialogue is going to turn into changes in phrasing in English because it was a good dialogue. That's a good sign. That's where you say, wow, talking with this translator really did help me think about what I was saying in English. So I'll do that. But there are no rules changes. This was not a design dialogue. It may be from that particular translator's point of view or a translator's point of view, that they have arrived at some understanding of the game that did not even exist for anyone yet, and that's what they're going to put in the translation, but that's their own personal experience. The game was designed prior to the translation process, redesigned, I should say, and rewritten. And then it benefited from the dialogues about translation. Now, how the translation actually turned out, I can't assess because I don't read Italian. I can puzzle through a lot of it, but I can't really read it. So that's as may be. But the game here in English, having benefited from that dialogue in terms of some aspects of phrasing and presentation, but by no means a reverse translation at all. That is not the case, nor was the translation process a design process. With any luck, that addresses the many questions or nuances that Claudio brought, and we can let anybody have whatever response to it they may want to have. Next question from James, which is super hard. Not hard in the sense of, okay, I'm going to have to dig into this, but hard in the sense of, wow, I don't know. So, number one, what's the 5-minute history of science fiction role playing? I'm thinking like a 5-minute version of that Three Fantasies thing. That may not be possible to do. ... Okay, yeah, it's not possible to do. For one thing, I can't do a 5 minutes on Three Fantasies. That's 5 weeks of work with labs. And more importantly, I'm really just, I have avoided so much science fiction role playing. I've done a lot, but in the fullness of all of my role playing, which is a very lot, science fiction gets very short shrift. Reasons for that in a moment. Because James very reasonably goes on with, remember, that may not be possible to do, ... And then, so let me focus in on it. What's the history of, say, the Traveler game, or the Star Wars one, or Star Trek, whichever of the three that's most interesting to you? If I were to have picked, I would have picked Star Trek. But this is where the I don't know and what the hell comes in, because arguably, I could easily, in retrospect, have made it my business throughout role-playing to focus on those Star Trek games, to pay attention to them, to meet the people who had participated in them, to learn more about their industry history, to know their systems, to have basically, engaged with them in ways that I have engaged since the late 70s with, for example, RuneQuest. But I haven't. Those of you who participated in some of my science fiction discussions probably know that I am deeply allergic to fandom and vice versa. Therefore, my enjoyment of science fiction and anything that it's adjacent to, which is everything, is enormous and a huge part of my life experience, but I've only really started sharing it out fairly recently. Number one, in the early seminars for Adept Play, there's one called SFTV, where I narrowed down our understanding of science fiction to that particular medium of television and its history and its content and stuff, and said, now how does that relate to role-playing history of science fiction, which actually made a lot of sense in my mind to do it that way. And there are some dialogues in that seminar that you can look at and get some ideas from, I hope. All of that is the context of really going, I don't know. I mean, look at, for example, that post that I did about Vampire, and the history of Vampire, the role-playing game. Yes, I was tentative about it because I had not played all these different editions. And at the moment, I was just beginning to play Vampire the Requiem 2nd edition. But I knew a lot of the people. and I had seen the developments of the company changes, and looking through the different authors, I realized how many of them that I knew, and I thought back to all the times that we had shared time together and thought about what they were talking about at the different periods, and I basically had enough contact with that history to be able to speak. And then when I go and look in at the Wikipedia and other history that you find of what company did what or which one was bought by what, then in making the little diagram about all of that, I'm very grounded in it. And I can read something and say, now that's some spin. You know, I know that guy. And I was talking to him in, 2008. And the way that the popular culture and then translating into Wikipedia or some other source becomes something that I'm kind of like, pull the other one. I'm grounded enough in that. Not don't know if I'm always right, but I'm grounded enough in that to be able to judge what I'm picking up. If I were to do that about the Star Trek games, and much more so about the Star Wars and Traveler ones, I would just be like, I would just be parroting what you or anybody could just do by, clicking on Wikipedia or TV tropes or God knows what, and, you know, getting what would effectively be a bunch of superficial, claims coming from deeply compromised sources and purposes. So I don't really have that for, what I need. And that's why I don't even, I mean, I wanted to. I was like, oh, well, I'll go and make a list of all the Star Trek editions. Yeah, but that would be original research right now. And then it wouldn't be original research either, because like I said, I am just, copying from these different things and taking what they say as given. So somebody ought to do that, okay? That 5-minute history of science fiction role playing, I don't think anyone's going to do that. But I really, really would like somebody who has some kind of experiential, not just customer based, but some kind of experiential contact. Somebody who could, basically talk to or has talked to this or that creator or publisher or whatever. It's the kind of when I speak confidently about hero games or Chaosium or TSR or any number of White Wolf, any number of these other things, it's because I have that contact. It doesn't mean I have the be all and the insider knowledge of all time or anything, but it means that I'm over a certain hump of being able to assess what I'm hearing and reading. For better or for worse, that assessment may be jaundiced. Who knows? But I'm not just, oh, Wikipedia says this, right? So if you have that kind of perspective on any of these three games or sets of games, because each one is this basket of publications, variously titled, variously designed, variously owned, variously sold, I'd love to see, your diagram of all these weird, titles and stuff. That would be fantastic.